The human skull consists of 22 bones, which in adults are mostly connected together through strong joints known as sutures. At first glance, the skull can appear as a single unit, but as complex as we are, we actually divide the skull into two regions called the Neurocranium, which surrounds the brain, and the Viscerocranium, which forms the face. In this video, we will go through all the bones of the skull that makes up the Neurocranium and talk about their landmarks, surfaces, and their function. Then, we will go through all of these tiny openings called foramina, which serve as passageway for nerves and blood vessels. And then in the next two videos, we will go through the bones of the Viscerocranium and the joints of the skull. Hello everyone, my name is Taim. I'm a medical doctor and I make animated medical lectures to make different topics in medicine visually easier to understand. If you would like a PDF version of this presentation, you can find it on my website, along with organized video lectures to help with your studying. Alright, let's get started. As we said earlier, the bones of the skull are divided into two systems, the Neurocranium and the Viscerocranium. Viscerocranium is a collection of bones that make up the face skeleton, and it's all of those bones you see here. The maxilla, zygomatic bone, palatine, lacrimal, nasal bone, and so on. We're not going to talk about these in this video, because in this video we will focus on the other part of the skull, which is the Neurocranium. Now, the Neurocranium forms the shape of the head and it protects the brain. To make this easier, we generally subdivide it into the bones of the skullcap, which consist of the Parietal Bone, Frontal Bone, and the Occipital Bone, and we have the bones of the cranial base, the floor of the skull basically. And these are the Temporal Bone, Sphenoid Bone, and the Ethmoidal Bone. Just a side note, notice that some bones have the number 2 after them. That means that we have 2 of those bones in our head. So if you go ahead and count all those bones, you'll get 22. Alright? Awesome. Now we are going very detailed here. My goal is to make you an expert in bone anatomy. So let's start with the bones of the skullcap. And again, they consist of one frontal bone in the front, 2 parietal bones on either side of the head, and 1 occipital bone on the backside. So let's do the parietal bone first. The parietal bones are those bilateral skull bones that form the superior and lateral walls of the cranium. So here we have the right and the left one, with the left highlighted. Okay, so the parietal bone has a frontal border, which connects to the frontal bone, forming the coronal suture. We got a sagittal border, which connects to the contralateral parietal bone, forming the sagittal suture. We got a occipital border, which connects to the occipital bone, forming the lambdoid suture. And we got the squamous border, which connects to the temporal bone and forms the squamous suture. The parietal lobe also has some angles. The angle towards the frontal bone is called the frontal angle. Back there is the occipital angle. Towards the sphenoid bone is the sphenoid angle. And then we got the mastoid angle. Alright, now let's go a little bit more detailed. These bones are really cooler than they look like. So the parietal bone has an internal surface facing the meninges and the brain, and an external surface. Now, focus on the internal surface for a moment. We can find the groove for the superior sagittal sinus. This groove is it contains the superior sagittal sinus, which is one of the major dural venous sinuses we have in the brain. Basically large veins that drain the brain from blood. I've got a video on those veins if you're not familiar with it. But we can also find the groove for the sigmoid sinus, which is another large vein in the brain, part of the dural venous sinuses. Apart from that, we can find some impressions, meaning grooves along the inner surface of the parietal bone that contains the middle meningeal artery and its branches. Alright, let's now look at the external surface. This one is a bit special. You see those two lines over on the lateral surface? The upper one is called the superior temporal line, which provides an attachment site for the temporal fascia. Just below it is the inferior temporal line, which provides an origin site for the temporalis muscle and forms the posterior-superior boundary of the temporal fossa. Then we got the parietal eminence. This is an area of the parietal bone where its convexity is at its maximum, meaning this is the highest curved part of the parietal bone. And in some individuals, the distance between the parietal eminence of the right and the left parietal bones represents the maximum width of the cranium. Then we can see a tiny little hole up there. This is called the parietal foramen. The parietal foramen allows for the passage of the parietal emissary vein. Emissary veins are the veins that connect the extracranial venous system with the intracranial venous system. So it just connects the veins on the outer side of the skull with the veins on the inner side of the skull through this opening. And in some individuals, the parietal foramen may only be present on one side or may even be absent bilaterally. Okay, so that's it for the parietal bone. Hope it made sense. Let's now do the frontal bone. The frontal bone is an unpaired flat bone that forms the forehead. Back here we have the parietal margin, which connects the frontal bone with the parietal bone to form the coronal suture. And then we have a supraorbital margin, which is the superior border of the orbit. And if we remove the left parietal bone and look at the frontal bone from the inside, we can see the sphenoidal margin. This is where the frontal bone meets the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. Makes much more sense to me to study the bones once I have a general idea of the margins. Alright, let's now hold the frontal bone and pull it out. We will see this. Now, because the frontal bone forms the forehead, parts of the orbit and parts of the nose, we therefore divide the frontal bone into 3 parts: a squamous part, a nasal part, and 2 paired orbital parts. Now let's highlight some structures on the frontal bone. The frontal bone has something called the frontal eminence. These are 2 prominent round areas on the external surface of the squamous part of the frontal bone. They are areas of the frontal bone where its convexity is at its maximum, and they also contain the ossification centers, so the first area of the bone to start ossifying. Alright, on the sides we can see the temporal lines. The temporal lines are 2 curved elevations of the frontal bone's outer surface. They extend from the zygomatic process, curve towards the parietal bone, and split into the superior and the inferior parts, which continue as the parietal temporal lines we saw earlier, providing attachment for the temporal fascia and marking the upper front boundary of the temporal fossa. Now the temporal fossa is one of the largest landmarks of the skull. It's a shallow depression that is formed by 4 skull bones, the parietal, temporal, frontal, and sphenoid bones. Kinda makes sense once we rush through the bones of the neurocranium, but it's mainly occupied by the temporalis muscle, which has a wide attachment spread across the fossa. And it also has some important neurovascular structures as well, such as the deep temporal vessels and nerves. Then we got the superciliary arch, which are paired arches located above the orbit. Between them is the glabella, which is a flattened area above the nasal root. And then all the way on the lateral surface is the zygomatic process, which connects to the zygomatic bone. Now, focus on the supraorbital margin for a moment. We can see the supraorbital notch, which is a notch or a foramen above the orbit that contains the supraorbital vessels and the lateral branch of the supraorbital nerve. Medial to the supraorbital notch is the frontal notch, which is a small ridge or sometimes a hole or a foramen, which transmits the medial branch of the supraorbital nerve. Let's take a look at the inner surface of the squamous part now. We can see a ridge on the midline of the frontal bone. The upper one is called the groove for the superior sagittal sinus, containing the superior sagittal sinus, which again is one of the dural venous sinuses in our brain. And below it is the frontal crest, which is the site of attachment of the falx cerebri. Within the orbit, we can see the fossa for the lacrimal gland, which contains the lacrimal gland responsible for production of tears. We can see the nasal spine of the frontal bone. The nasal spine helps form the bony nasal septum and the fronto-ethmoidal suture. On the medial surface of the orbit, we can see the trochlear fovea, which is a small depression where the trochlea of the superior oblique muscle attaches. In some people, instead of a shallow depression, a bony projection called the trochlear spine can be present in the same location. Then, if we look at the bottom surface of the frontal bone, we can see the anterior ethmoidal groove, which is a small depression on the medial orbital part of the frontal bone that forms the anterior ethmoidal foramen with the ethmoidal bone, allowing passage for the anterior ethmoidal nerve and vessels. And behind it, similarly, is the posterior ethmoidal groove, which is also a depression that forms the posterior ethmoidal foramen with the ethmoidal bone, transmitting the posterior ethmoidal nerves and vessels. Okay, now the frontal bone is quite interesting. Look at the skull from an anterior perspective, cut it in half, look at it from this side, and we can see a hole within the frontal bone. And this is famously known as a frontal sinus. The frontal sinus is the most superior of the 4 paranasal sinuses we have, and it develops after the first year of life, reaching to full size by adulthood. So when you breathe in, air enters the frontal sinus, where it gets warmed and humidified. This happens because the sinus is lined with respiratory mucosa that helps condition the air before it reaches your lungs. The frontal sinus also makes the skull lighter and may help resonate your voice, make it sound clearer. It drains into the middle nasal meatus through a small passage called the frontonasal duct, and it has a thin septum separating the frontal sinus into left and right side. In some cases, the frontal sinus can become inflamed due to an infection, leading to frontal sinusitis, which may cause headaches, facial pain, and pressure above both eyes, usually because the draining pathway is clogged. Alright, so that is the frontal bone. Let's now do the occipital bone. The occipital bone is an unpaired bone which covers the back of the head. It makes up a large portion of the basilar part of the neurocranium and entirely houses the cerebellum. The occipital bone is composed of 4 main parts: the squamous part, the basilar part, and 2 lateral parts, and a large hole in the middle, known as the foramen magnum, which contains the medulla oblongata as it changes into the spinal cord. It also contains the vertebral arteries, the anterior spinal artery, the paired posterior spinal arteries, the spinal root of the accessory nerve, and the spinal vein. Let's look at the occipital bone from the inside as well, and then take a mental picture of this. Let's now isolate the occipital bone. So here we see the 3 parts and the foramen magnum. And now let's highlight the most important landmarks of this bone and focus on the external surface first. Here we can see the external occipital protuberance, which is a palpable tubercle on the posterior surface of the skull. It is typically more palpable in males and serves as an attachment point for the nuchal ligament and the trapezius muscle. Extending inferiorly is the external occipital crest, which is a vertical crest for the attachment of the nuchal ligaments. Then we got the highest nuchal line, the superior nuchal line, serving as an attachment for the trapezius, and the inferior nuchal line, serving as an attachment for the rectus capitis posterior major and minor. Next we have the condylar fossae, which are 2 depressions on the underside of the occipital bone. They accommodate the atlas's superior articular facets during head extension, and in some individuals, a condylar canal can be seen in its floor, and when this canal is present, it allows for the passage of an emissary vein, which connects the sigmoid sinus inside the skull to veins in the neck. Then we can see the occipital condyles, which are 2 oval projections on the underside of the occipital bone that provides attachment for the alar ligament and form the atlanto-occipital joints by articulating with the atlas, allowing head movements. Then we got the pharyngeal tubercle, which is a small midline bump on the underside of the basilar part of the occipital bone. It serves as an attachment point for the pharyngeal raphe, which supports the muscles of the pharynx during swallowing. Now, to make it easier to navigate, we typically landmark the external surface of the occipital bone by dividing it into 2 main areas, the occipital plane and the nuchal plane. The occipital plane is a smooth upper part providing attachment for the epicranial aponeurosis, and in contrast, the nuchal plane is a rough lower part where many neck muscles insert and the nuchal ligament attaches, helping with head movements. For the borders, we can see the lambdoid border, which forms the lambdoid suture with the parietal bone. We can see the mastoid border, which connects to the temporal bone to form the occipito-mastoid suture. We can see the spheno-occipital synchondrosis, which is a cartilaginous connection between the sphenoid and the occipital bone. Alright, let's now quickly do the inner surface. On the inner surface of the basilar part, we can see the clevus, which is a slope on the internal surface located beneath the brainstem, containing the basilar artery and the basilar venous plexus. Then we got the groove for the inferior petrosal sinus. There's a jugular notch, which forms the jugular foramen, together with the jugular notch of the temporal bone. And sometimes we can see the intrajugular process, which is located inside the jugular notch and separate the jugular foramen into 2 components. Okay, what else can we see here? We can see the groove for the sigmoid sinus, which contains the sigmoid sinus. We can see the internal occipital protuberance, which contains the confluence of sinuses, which is the connection point of the transverse, straight, superior sagittal and the occipital sinuses. We can also see the cruciform eminence, which is a cross-shaped prominence formed by the grooves of the occipital, superior sagittal and the transverse sinuses, and it divides the occipital bone into 2 cerebral fossae and 2 cerebellar fossae. We can see the groove for the transverse sinus, which contains the transverse sinus as well as the attachment of the tentorium cerebelli. We can see the groove for the superior sagittal sinus, which contains the superior sagittal sinus and the attachment of the falx cerebri. And we can see the groove for the occipital sinus, which contains the occipital sinus and attachment of the falx cerebelli. And here you see how those dural venous sinuses occupy each groove. So those are all the bones I wanted to talk about in this segment. Those are all the bones of the skull cap. Next, let's quickly run through the bones of the cranial base, which are the temporal bone, sphenoid, and the ethmoidal bone. Now let's take the skull and look at it from the inside and grey out the bones we talked about earlier. So we now have the temporal bone, sphenoid bone, and the ethmoidal bone. Let's now start with the temporal bone. The temporal bone is a paired bone that consists of three main parts: the squamous part, the petrous part, and the tympanic part, which is the area underneath here where your ear canal opens up at. Now, orientation is key in understanding this bone. Keeping the same view, let's isolate the lateral bone and the superior view of this bone. So here again, we see the three parts it's made out of. And now let's highlight the most important landmark of this bone, because it has so many functions. If we start with the squamous part, the most noticeable structure is the zygomatic process. The zygomatic process is a long, thin projection of the temporal bone that extends forward to form the posterior part of the zygomatic arch, connecting with the zygomatic bone at the temporozygomatic suture. It has an articular tubercle, which provides attachment for the temporal fascia, masseter muscle, and the lateral ligament of the temporomandibular joint. We can see the supramasseter crest, which is the dorsal continuation of the zygomatic process. And we can see the mandibular fossae, which is the articular fossae for the temporomandibular joint, allowing free jaw movements. Alright, now let's do the tympanic part. The tympanic part is located here, this whole area here. Now, chances are you've probably seen this picture somewhere. This is an image illustrating how the external ear, middle ear, and the internal ear look like. All of your ear components are located within the tympanic part of the temporal bone. Now, let's expand on this. We can see the eustachian tube here as well, leading to the pharynx. The entrance into the external ear is called the external acoustic opening, which leads way into the external acoustic meatus, or the ear canal, which goes all the way to the tympanic membrane. The tympanic membrane is a thin, cone-shaped structure that separates the external ear from the middle ear, vibrating in response to sound waves. Surrounding the tympanic membrane is the tympanic ring, a bony ridge within the tympanic part of the temporal bone. It provides structural support for the tympanic membrane and helps anchoring it in place. So the external acoustic opening is here. Now look at the external acoustic opening from the temporal bone. We can see the petrotympanic fissure just anterior to it. This narrow slit connects the tympanic cavity to the infratemporal fossa and allows passage for the chorda tympani nerves and the anterior tympanic artery. Okay, so we covered the squamous part, we covered the temporal part, and then we have the petrous part. So let's go ahead and cover that one. The petrous part of the temporal bone has an anterior surface and a posterior surface. There is a superior border which attaches to the tentorium cerebelli and contains the groove for the superior petrosal sinus. Then the pointy end here is called the apex of the petrous part. Posteriorly, we got the posterior border which connects to the occipital bone, and then if you look at the inferior view, we can find the inferior surface containing some structures here as well. So let's go ahead and cover all of these structures here. On the anterior surface, we can see the tegument tympani. The tegument tympani is considered a weakened part of the skull because it is a thin bony plate that separates the middle ear from the middle cranial fossae. And because it's very thin, it's prone to fractures or erosions, especially in cases of chronic ear infections or increased intracranial pressure. And if compromised, infections can spread from the middle ear to the brain, leading to serious conditions like meningitis and brain abscesses. Alright, next is the arcuate eminence, which is a bulge formed by the anterior semicircular canals. Then we got the groove for the lesser petrosal nerve, which transmits the lesser petrosal nerve, groove for the greater petrosal nerve, and the trigeminal impression, which is a shallow fossae for the trigeminal ganglion. If we change the angle here, we can see the groove for the inferior petrosal sinus. There are many grooves on these bones for the dural venous sinuses. We can see the subarcuate fossae, which is a small depression on the posterior surface. We can see the jugular notch, which, remember, forms the jugular foramen together with the occipital bone. Other things we can see is the masseter process. The masseter process is a large bony projection that contains masseter air cells, which help regulate ear pressure and serves as an attachment site for muscles like the sternocleidomastoid, splenius capitis, and longissimus capitis. Next to it is the masseter notch, serving as the origin for the posterior belly of the digastricus. We have the groove for the occipital artery, and then we can see the styloid process, which is a thin, pointed projection that serves as an attachment site for the stylopharyngeus, styloglossus, and the stylohyoid muscles, along with the stylomandibular and the stylohyoid ligaments. Right next to it is the stylomasseter foramen, which is the external opening of the facial canal. Lastly, we can see the groove for the sigmoid sinus. Now, you see the internal acoustic opening here? It makes way for the facial nerve to exit the skull through the stylomasseter foramen. This canal is called the facial canal, and we divide it into the labyrinth part, geniculum, tympanic part, and the masseter part, depending on which region it lies in. Alright, that was the temporal bone. I told you this is going to be a very detailed video. I will make you an expert in this. Next, the sphenoid bone is a beautiful bone. This is a butterfly-shaped bone located at the base of the skull, forming part of the cranium, orbit, and the nasal cavity. In a way, it's literally the center of our skull, connecting the neurocranium with the viscerocranium. The sphenoid bone consists of an unpaired body and 3 paired projections, the greater wing, lesser wing, and pterygoid processes. Now, the sphenoid bone has holes leading structures through it, one of which is the superior orbital fissure, leading certain cranial nerves from the brain to the orbit. We have the optic canal, leading the ophthalmic artery, ophthalmic plexuses, and the optic nerve to the eye. We got the foramen rotundum, which contains the maxillary nerve. We got the foramen ovale for the mandibular nerve. And then, if we tilt it a little bit, we can see the foramen spinosum, which contain the middle meningeal artery and vein, and the meningeal branch of the mandibular nerve. Then, if we look at the anterior skull, there's the superior orbital fissure, and then down here, between the greater wing and the maxilla, is the inferior orbital fissure, which contain things like the zygomatic nerve, infraorbital nerve and artery, and the inferior ophthalmic vein. Now, let's run through the landmarks of this bone. Here is a very important structure called the sella turcica, which is Latin for the Turkish saddle. It consists of the hypophyseal fossa, which contains the hypophysis. Posterior wall is called the dorsum sellae, that has the posterior clinoid processes on either side, which functions as the attachment of the sellar diaphragm and the tentorium cerebelli. In the front, we have the tuberculum sellae. Then we have the chiasmatic sulcus, or the pre-chiasmatic sulcus is also called, which is a shallow groove located anterior to the optic chiasma. Then we got the anterior clinoid process, which provides another attachment point for the tentorium cerebelli. And posteriorly, we can see the clivus, and on the sides, the carotid sulcus for the internal carotid artery. Let's now turn it to the front. We can see the sphenoid crest and the sphenoid rostrum. Then we got the sphenoid conchae, each located lateral to the sphenoid crest, and contribute to the formation of the anterior wall of the sphenoid sinus. For the pterygoid processes, we got the medial plate for the attachment of the superior constrictors of the pharynx, and the lateral plate, which serves as an origin for the inferior head of the lateral pterygoid muscle. At the bottom of the medial plate, we have the pterygoid hamulus, which serves as a pulley for the tensor veli palatini tendon during swallowing. Posteriorly, we can see the pterygoid fossa, which serves as the origin for the medial pterygoid muscle, and the scaphoid fossa, origin for the tensor veli palatini. Alright, finally, let's run through the last bone, the ethmoidal bone. The ethmoidal bone is quite interesting. It serves as the medial wall of the orbit and forms part of the nasal cavities. And if we now remove the skull bones, you will see that it looks like this. It has 3 major parts. We have the cribriform plate at the top, perpendicular plate, and then the ethmoidal labyrinth on either side. So let's look at it from both the anterior perspective and the superior perspective. At the top, we can see the cribriform foramina, small holes that transmit the olfactory nerves. There's the crista galli, which is a bony plate that form part of the attachment of the falx cerebri. Facing the orbits are the orbital plates. We can see the posterior ethmoidal cells, which open into the posterior nasal meiosis. Now, within the ethmoidal bone, we can find air bubbly bony rooms called ethmoidal cells. And they're generally divided into the anterior, middle, and the posterior ethmoidal cells. So anterior and middle air cells open into the middle nasal meatus, and posterior ethmoidal air cells open into the superior nasal meatus. Then we got the nasal conchae, which divide the nasal cavity into nasal meatai. So we have the superior nasal conchae hidden in there, and middle nasal conchae, which has an arch projection called the uncinate process. So there we go, finally done with all the detailed anatomy of all of the bones of the neurocranium. Lastly, just very quickly, I want to run you through the main foramina of the skull, so you have them all in one place. We first have the foramen magnum for the brainstem and the spinal cord. In there we have the hypoglossal canal for mainly the hypoglossal nerve. We got the jugular foramen, which contains things like the internal jugular vein, glossopharyngeal nerve, vagus nerve, accessory nerve, and the posterior meningeal artery. We got the internal acoustic meatus, which contained the facial nerve, the 7th cranial nerve, vestibulocochlear nerve, the 8th cranial nerve, labyrinthine arteries and veins, and the vestibular ganglion. We got the foramen lacerum for things like the internal carotid artery, internal carotid plexus, internal carotid venous plexus, deep petrosal nerve, greater petrosal nerve, lesser petrosal nerve, and the recurrent branch of the foramen lacerum. We got the foramen spinosum, which contains the middle meningeal artery and veins, and the meningeal branch of the mandibular nerve, foramen ovale for the mandibular nerve, and the foramen rotundum, which contains the maxillary nerve. Alright, we finally managed to go through the detailed anatomy of all the bones of the neurocranium. In the next video, we will go through the bones of the viscerocranium, all the bones you see here on the right. If you want handmade PDF versions of this lecture or an organized list of all my videos, you can find everything on my website. Thank you so much for watching another one of my videos. If you enjoyed or learned something new, don't forget to like, comment your favorite moment, subscribe, turn on those notifications so you never miss a video. If you're looking for other ways to support, check out the link in the description. Have fun y'all, peace.